Father, you and I both know that if this congregation knew all the things about me, they'd hardly believe a word I have to say, except for your grace, except for your commitment to love us into transformation. So then may the words of my mouth, the meditation of my heart, be both acceptable in your sight and filled with your truth. I pray in the name of Jesus the Christ. Amen. Please be seated. I want to thank you for the warm welcome and the privilege of being here with you today. I first met Jeff Simpson, and he befriended me, and we had a number of really delightful conversations at various places at Camp Allen and at Bishop Andy Doyle's home for the annual Christmas party that the bishop and his wife host the clergy of the diocese. And he introduced me to David, and then a really dear friend of mine who has preached here at St. Thomas by the name of Chuck Collins. Chuck and I went to seminary together from the same congregation in El Paso, Texas. Chuck has recently, he and his wife Ellen have recently relocated to Houston. And when Chuck and Ellen and I got together, about the third question he asked me was, have you met David Browder yet? So it's, he is admired by association. And I'm delighted that in this last year, David and I have met on several occasions and become friends. It goes without saying that all the ways David and Jeff lead the service as the officiant, someplace along the line, I'm not going to do it right. And it can be as irritating for some as clergy who don't know how to keep a stole on symmetrical. And so I just thank you in advance for your tolerance, your forgiveness, and it's quite all right to chuckle. So I will probably do something out of order somehow. I have the privilege and the frustrations of being the pastor of a church of and for the homeless. So many of the stories that I have heard in the 6 years I have been the vicar and executive director of Lord of the Streets, so many of the stories I hear are of horrific childhood neglect or abuse, or the lack of healthy or credible adults who provide reliable mentorship or role models, stories of misguided choices that the men and women who now come to lots for services have made through their lives, and then to hear of the lingering, undermining impact that still affects them. These stories are all too frequent, and they are all too tragic and heartbreaking. They will tell me of all the times they have tried and failed to turn their lives around, or tried and failed to break generational patterns that are destructive for themselves and others, or they have tried and failed to become an economic or a familial success. And it is easy to at least understand why there are more in that community who speak openly of God as their only source of hope and help. It's easy to understand why they speak that way, more than I readily hear God spoken of that way in many congregations. You see, when you haven't tasted success, you're not tempted to take credit. Such was not the life circumstance of the Jewish man featured in today's gospel story. Nicodemus, unlike the people that I get the privilege of hanging with on the streets every day, is introduced to us in verse 1 of John chapter 3 as both a Pharisee and a ruler, a person who was really clear about his beliefs, having been schooled in those beliefs, having been one who made a commitment to a particular school of thought within Judaism, and then had risen through the ranks to be an esteemed leader known as a ruler, somebody with responsibility in the community. Not only was he clear about what he believed and that it was to be a point of impact in his life, but verse 2 tells us by inference that he was a person of some emotional intelligence. He approached Jesus and he was respectful, he was curious, he was intrigued, but he still desired to protect his reputation as not having too many questions, and thus he appeared at night, so nobody would suspect that there were any chinks in his armor, any holes in his belief system that didn't translate into a life that he found satisfying. He was religious, he was intellectual, he was social, and he had a lot to lose if he let anybody know that life wasn't working well for him. So in the midst of his polite introduction and affirmation of Jesus, we know that no one could do the works that you do unless God was with him. Before he had a chance to establish the normal pattern among the Pharisees and the Jewish theological leaders of some kind of back and forth dialectic with questions and permutations of the answers, before any of that could happen, Jesus interrupted him. He cut through the intro, he cut through the philosophical, and he disturbed the normal pattern that Nicodemus would have been used to. You see, Nicodemus had seen something different in Jesus, something more authentic and appealing in Jesus than he had experienced in his own circle of faith. So Jesus threw him off the back and forth dialectic game with this simple declaration: the only people able to see, understand, or enter into and be a part of the kingdom of what God is doing both in individuals and communities are those who have been born again. You can talk out of your head until you're blue in the face, but you will not see, you will not understand, and you will not be a part of what God is doing in individuals or communities unless you've been born again. You start over, no certainty of your standing with God, no certainty about the correctness of all of your beliefs or customs, no credit for your life standing, no pride in your accomplishments. You've got to be just like a baby. You brought nothing into this, and you can't take credit for anything upon your arrival. In verses 4 and 9, Nicodemus responds to what Jesus has said with the same basic question. Still motivated, I believe, by a desire in Nicodemus for a more satisfying internal reality than for external ease and accolades. His one response was how? How can a person be born again? How can a person be born of the Spirit? How can a person be blown by the wind of the Spirit onto the life-giving pathway of relationship with God that is less symbol and more substance? I think I first heard the phrase born again my sophomore year of high school in Fort Worth, Texas. Until then, I had spent the first 3 years of school when my family moved to Fort Worth when my own father got out of the military in a Roman Catholic school system. I promise you, I never heard the phrase born again. I was a sophomore at a public high school, and after I'd been there a month or so trying to make friends, which wasn't easy for me, one of my classmates said, "You know, Steve, I don't know anything about you. Have you been born again?" And I looked at him like a cow looking at a new gate. Born again. It just kind of hung there. In 1974, there was a member of the Episcopal Church who was not unlike Nicodemus. He was highly educated, he was well-connected, he was admired within the circles of his profession, he was ambitious, and yet he wanted to make a positive contribution through his life. Nonetheless, in spite of all of that, he found himself, though religious, with his moral compass more than compromised. He was about to be arrested and arraigned on criminal charges. He knew he and his colleagues had crossed the line and that prison was a real possibility facing him. It was then, before any court trials, that a prominent businessman friend gave him a copy of Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. He asked him to read it. And he said, "If you'll read it, I'll be praying for you, and then I want to meet again in a couple of weeks to hear what you get out of it." So, this man read the book. And in light of what he read, he reviewed his life. And this Episcopal layman realized that he was connected to the church, but he didn't know the Lord of the church. He concluded that if left as the captain of his own fate, he would run aground and shipwreck himself and those he cared about, and that he had been fighting rather needlessly for the gifts of love and purpose and joy that God in Christ had already provided and offered him. So having read the book and before he ever met with his friend, he found himself kneeling in his house, asking that the one he had heard in the liturgy over and over and over again had died for his sins, been raised from the dead, asking him to be the living God in his life. The change at one level was immediate and profound. Chuck Colson, the man of whom I'm speaking, known as President Richard Nixon's hatchet man, even asked after this to be able to plead guilty of charges that the government prosecution could not prove. Because he said, "Though I may not be guilty of that, there is so much I know I am guilty of, even if not criminal." As a result, he was sent to prison. And in prison, he realized that no one is free, whether in or out of prison, as long as they've not been liberated from themselves, from their past, by the same Jesus that Nicodemus sought out and heard say, "Believe in me, not yourself. Believe in me, not your faith. Believe in me, not your good or bad fortune." 4 years before Chuck Colson's conversion from churchianity to Christianity, 4 years before that, going from being an Episcopalian to a Christ follower who happened to be in the Episcopal Church, I was at a young person's camp in northwest Minnesota. I was not quite 17 years of age. I heard a talk that week on the 10 Commandments from Jesus' perspective. The camp speaker had said, "How about if I said to you that the one who makes up a game gets to make up the rules?" Well, that made sense. Then he said, "Suppose I asked you to assume for a moment the story that there is a God who made the world. If there's a God that made the world, couldn't that God make up the rules?" Well, again, that made sense to me. He said, "Suppose I said to you that God only had 10 rules, and the rules of the game were that if you follow those 10 rules your whole life, then you and God are tight both now and forever." I thought, well, that's reasonable, but I'm now uncomfortable. Then he said, "What if I said to you this God is so generous, so gracious, that he has relaxed things and said, if you will only keep one rule, try and keep them all, but if you succeed in not violating at least one rule your whole life, then you and God are tight and you're good forever." And I liked my odds. But then he went through some of what Jesus said that elaborated on the 10 Commandments. Things like, you've heard it said, "You shall not commit adultery," but I tell you, as long as you objectify anybody and look on them as an object of satisfying your own desires, you're just as guilty as the person who commits adultery. Or the one I knew I hadn't violated, "Thou shalt do no murder," but Jesus said, "I tell you, if you call your brother an empty-headed fool, worthless, damn you, go to hell," that you've just said that somebody who is prized in the eyes of God is of no use to you. And you've done just as much violence as murder. Here I am, not quite 17 years of age, and after a 20-minute talk, I have violated all 10 commandments in thought, word, and deed. And if my past performance was any indicator of my future behavior, I was in a world of hurt. I didn't understand the full reason for the crucifixion that I'd heard about growing up in the church. I didn't understand the violence of the cross or how that took care of anything, but this much I remembered from the stories and the liturgy, that it was love that drove Jesus to take a punishment of separation from God that I deserved. And if he loved me that much, I wanted him in charge of my life. So an almost 17-year-old boy goes out on the hillside overlooking this crystal clear lake with 1,000 million stars and celestial bodies reflected in the surface. I prayed no sinner's prayer. I simply let the love of God bathe me. As I said, I want you to be in charge of my life. A couple years later, I had a chance to go visit my 3 spinster great aunts in Hartford, Connecticut. I was in the military by that point. My wife was living about 1,800 miles away while I went through some training, and so my aunts invited me to come and spend Thanksgiving weekend with them. I began praying 6 weeks before I got there that God would give me an opportunity to share the story of the changes that Jesus was bringing to my life. I walked in the door at midnight after train delays, and my 86-year-old great aunt put a hamburger on a griddle, sat down with me, the 3 of them, Frances, Dorothy, and Rosemary. And Frances said, "Stephen, your mother tells us you've become quite religious." I cringed but was excited. It seems like God was answering my prayer. In my evangelistic zeal, I was going to get an opportunity to share with them, and maybe they too would say, I want to know this Christ who said you must be born again. They said, would you tell us the story of what happened? At the end of my brief little story, Francis looked at Dorothy and looked at Rosemary and then looked back at me and said, you know, Stephen, I don't remember for sure whether I was 4 or 5 when I first prayed a prayer almost exactly like that. Jesus, I want you to be in charge of my life. But I have been praying some version of that prayer every day of my life for the last 80 plus years. And blown to smithereens was this idea I had in my head that you had to have an adult conscious conversion to Christ to be a real Christian. No, Jesus said, the wind bloweth where it will. And God uses a myriad of forces and factors inside and outside our life to create an appetite for what God alone can and wants to give. A new start as a child in the Father's heart. You may have heard the story of the man who dies and shows up at the gates of heaven, and Peter is there and is glad to greet him. And after a few moments, Peter said, you may know that it takes 100 points to get into heaven. You can show up at the gates, but to actually enter, you've got to have 100 points. And the man said, no, I didn't know that. Well, how do I earn it? And Peter said, well, tell me something about your life. And he said, well, I was raised in the church. I was an acolyte. I stayed active all my life. I became president of the youth group. And Peter said, you know, that's remarkable. I don't hear that story very often. That's 1 point. The man was shaking a little bit. He said, well, I went to college and to graduate school, and I never quit going to church. I was active in a campus fellowship, and then I was in a young professionals Christian group, and I went to church the whole time I was in college and graduate school. And Peter said, you know, I don't get 1 in 1,000 that say anything like that. That's 1 point. The man was feeling all the energy drain out of him. He said, you know, I might have been Pollyannish, but I was pretty pure. I didn't have sex outside of marriage. I was faithful to my wife for over 40 years that we were together. I raised my children. I stayed active in the church. I served on the vestry. I was both the senior warden and junior warden at different points. And Peter said, you lived a really stellar life. That's 1 point. The man started going through his professional accomplishments and how he'd provided. And at the end of those, Peter said, truly remarkable. That's 1 more point. And the man looked at him and said, Jesus Christ, I'll never get in. And Peter said, that's 96 points. Who knows what it takes for the wind of the Spirit to blow into our lives, to bring to us an awareness of both our need and our desire, to have more than religion, but to have a vibrant relationship of the living God who said, you've got to be born again. It's not of the flesh, it's not of the will, it's by the Spirit of the Lord. And all who come to me will be refreshed, and I will never cast away.
Amen.